Don Aurelio Ibarra had not lit the lamp on the porch in 11 months, not since his wife died. When a knock came at the door just past dark on the coldest evening Nombre de Dios, Durango, had seen in 20 years. He had been sitting in the old chair on the corredor, La Silla del Corredor, the one his father had made from the wood of a walnut tree the year he was born, with his hands open on his knees and nothing in them. The way he sat most evenings now, not waiting for anything, just sitting, because that was what the night required. If you believe a man can be changed by something as small as a knock at the door, subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo and ring the bell so you never miss a story. He almost did not answer. He had not answered the door for company in 11 months either. But something in the sound of it, 3 knocks, measured, not urgent, but not casual, the knock of someone who knows what it costs to ask, made him set his hands on his knees and stand up. He opened the door. She was standing on the threshold with a child of perhaps 3 years pressed against her side, and both of them soaked through from the sleet that had begun an hour before. She was young, perhaps 25, with the face of someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long she had stopped noticing the weight. She was not wearing a coat. The boy had a coat, a small brown one that was doing its best. She had given him hers somewhere along the way. In her arms she held a bundle wrapped in a patched blanket, the cobija remendada, pieced together from at least 4 different fabrics, none of them matching, all of them worn thin. The bundle moved. She was pregnant. The blanket was not covering cargo. It was covering her belly. She did not apologize. She did not explain. She looked at him with eyes that had already spent everything they had on the walk to this door and said, quietly, in the voice of someone who is not begging but is asking with everything that remains, please, let my child and me stay the night. God willing, just the night. Don Aurelio stepped back from the door. Come in, he said. He said it the way he made decisions, without ceremony. A fact rather than a gesture. Come in because the night is cold and a pregnant woman with a child is standing in sleet, and there is no version of this where you leave her on the threshold. Come in, full stop. Her name was Esperanza Vidal. She told him this while he was putting the kettle on for something warm, because it seemed like the kind of information a person deserved to give when someone opened a door to them. She had been walking for 2 days, she said. She had come from the town of San Juan del Ro, 40 kilometers north, where she had been living in a room on the property of her late husband's family, the Fuentes family, until 3 weeks ago, when her father-in-law, Don Clemente Fuentes, had told her the room was needed and that she had until the end of the month to find another arrangement. She had found none. She had no family within reach. She had money enough for perhaps 4 days, and she did not say this last part, but Don Aurelio could see it in how carefully she set her bag on the floor, as if it contained something that needed protecting, even though it clearly contained very little. The boy, whose name was Toms, fell asleep at the kitchen table before the warm milk was finished, his head resting on his small arms, still wearing his coat. Esperanza watched him the way mothers watch sleeping children when they are not sure where they will be sleeping themselves. You can have the back room, Don Aurelio said. Both of you. It's warm. She looked at him for a moment. Then, she said, thank you. I'll leave in the morning. You'll leave when you're ready, he said. The morning will wait. What neither of them knew that night, what Esperanza could not have known, and what Don Aurelio would not understand until weeks later, was that the faded photograph tucked into the inside pocket of his wife's old Bible, still sitting on the nightstand in the bedroom he no longer used, was a photograph of a man and a woman standing in front of a small farmhouse. The man was young, perhaps 30. and behind him the land stretched flat and dry toward the Sierra. The woman beside him was smiling in the way people smile when they do not know the photograph is being taken. The man in the photograph was Don Aurelio's father, and the woman beside him was a Vidal. But that night, all of that was still waiting. Esperanza stayed more than one night. She stayed because the cold did not break, and then she stayed because she became useful, and then she stayed because useful became necessary, and by the time any of that could be examined clearly, the finca had already begun to change around her. The second morning she was there, she swept the corridor before Don Aurelio was up. He found her when he came out at first light, moving the broom in long, deliberate strokes, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before saying anything. He had not seen anyone sweep that corridor in 11 months. His wife had swept it every morning. He had not been able to make himself do it. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," said Esperanza. She did not stop. He went to see to the cattle. When he came back an hour later, the coffee was made. Don Aurelio's farm, 200 hectares of high Durango grassland, a cattle operation his family had run for 3 generations, had been failing quietly for the better part of 2 years. Not catastrophically, the way neglect fails, gradually in the details. A fence line that needed mending, left unmended. A section of the irrigation ditch that needed clearing, left silted. The cattle count had dropped from 120 head to 87, partly from a bad season, and partly from a bad arrangement with a buyer in Chihuahua that Don Aurelio's late wife had always told him would end badly, and had ended badly. 3 of the ranch hands had left when the wages went irregular. What remained was Don Aurelio, 61 years old, and one aging hand named Crisanto, who had worked the finca since before Don Aurelio was born and had no intention of leaving because he had nowhere else to be. Esperanza saw all of this within the first week. She did not say anything about it. She just began. She began with a kitchen, which Don Aurelio had been using as a place to set things down rather than a place to cook. She made coffee in the mornings, clay pot coffee, from the old olla his wife had kept on the back shelf, and she made it early, before anyone was up, so that when Don Aurelio came in from the first rounds of the morning, there was something warm waiting. She did not ask permission to do this. She simply did it, the way women who have been managing households under difficult conditions do things, without announcement, without making the doing of it into a statement. She cooked in the evenings, too. Not elaborate meals, beans, tortillas, whatever the pantry had, stretched with the practical patience of someone who has learned that a full pot is a problem to be solved, not a condition to wait for. Don Aurelio ate what she put on the table. After the first week, he stopped saying he was not hungry because she did not argue with it, which was more effective than arguing. The old chair, La Silla del Corredor, his father's chair, had been sitting at an angle in the corner of the corridor, where Don Aurelio had moved it 11 months ago, and then not moved it again, because moving it felt like a decision about what it was for. Toms found it on the 3rd day and dragged it to the edge of the yard, where the light was better, and sat in it to watch Crisanto work with the horses. Nobody moved it back. That was how it began to belong to the mornings instead of the corner. The boy Toms attached himself to Crisanto within the first 3 days, which Crisanto received with the careful dignity of a man who had not had a child underfoot in many years, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he had missed it without knowing it. He began explaining things to the boy in the detailed, patient way old men explain things to children when they have decided the child is worth the effort. The names of the cattle, the difference between the 2 mares, the meaning of the clouds when they stacked up over the western ridge in the afternoon. Toms listened with absolute seriousness. The wooden toy horse he carried everywhere, a small carved thing, one ear chipped off, painted brown once and now mostly worn to pale wood, he sat on top of a fence post one morning while Crisanto worked. And Crisanto left it there and worked around it, because some things a child puts somewhere are not for moving. The cobia remendada, the patched blanket, stayed folded on the chair in the back room during the day, and came out at night when Esperanza tucked it around Toms before she slept. Don Aurelio noticed it the second week, when he passed the open doorway and saw Toms asleep under it. He recognized the stitching on one of the patches, a cross-stitch pattern his mother had used on linens. He did not mention it. He filed it away in the quiet part of himself where things went that he did not yet know what to do with. She was the one who noticed the fence line in the north pasture on a Thursday 3 weeks after she arrived. She had walked that far with Toms because the boy needed space to run and the yard had limited possibilities. She came back and said, without preamble, the north fence has 3 sections down. The cattle will drift into the Salinas property before the week is out. Don Aurelio looked at her. I know, he said. I can help Crisanto fix it, she said. You're 8 months along, he said. I can hold wire, she said. Crisanto can do the posts. He did not argue, because there was no argument available that she would have found convincing, and because she was right about the fence and about what she could do. The 3 of them went out the next morning, Don Aurelio, Crisanto, and Esperanza, with Toms following Crisanto like a small, serious shadow, and they mended the fence in sections over 2 days. By the second afternoon, Crisanto had stopped pretending he needed to help Esperanza, and had started simply working alongside her the way you work alongside someone whose capability you have accepted. Your wife worked like this, Crisanto said to Don Aurelio on the ride back the second day. He said it simply, as an observation. Don Aurelio did not answer. But he held the reins differently after that, the way a man holds something when he has just been reminded it exists. The baby came on a Sunday, at the end of January, in the back room, with the midwife from the pueblo, and Crisanto standing in the corridor with his hat in both hands, and Toms asleep under the cobija remendada in the chair Don Aurelio had moved in from the kitchen, because Toms had decided it was the right chair for waiting. The baby was a girl. Esperanza named her Flor. For no reason, she explained, and for every reason anyone who had watched the last 3 months could understand. Don Aurelio was in the corridor when the midwife came out. He was standing against the wall, with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing faces do when they are trying not to do anything. The midwife told him both were fine, God be praised. He nodded. He went to the kitchen and made coffee, and left a cup outside the bedroom door. 3 days after Flor was born, Don Clemente Fuentes arrived. He came with 2 men Don Aurelio did not know, and a document he set on the kitchen table without being invited to sit down. He was a thick-necked man of 65, with the manner of someone accustomed to having his arrivals treated as events. He said he had tracked Esperanza here through the pueblo. People talked. Someone had seen her arrive at the finca. Someone else had mentioned it to someone else. He said the room she had occupied on his property in San Juan del Rio had contained certain items that belonged to the Fuentes estate. Items she had taken when she left. Items, Don Aurelio said. Documents, Don Clemente said. Papers belonging to my son's estate. She has no right to them. Esperanza had come to the kitchen doorway. She was 3 days from giving birth, and she was standing straight, with the doorframe at her back, holding nothing and braced against nothing except herself. The papers are mine, she said. They were my husband's papers. He left them to me. Your husband's estate belongs to the Fuentes family, Don Clemente said. You are not a Fuentes. Whatever he signed in your favor was signed under duress. He said this the way a man says something he has practiced, smoothly, without hesitation, as though smoothness were the same thing as truth. Don Aurelio looked at the document on his kitchen table. Then he looked at Esperanza. Then he looked back at Don Clemente. "Pick that up," he said, meaning the document. Don Clemente looked at him. "Pick it up and take it with you," Don Aurelio said, "because it's not going to sit on my table. And then leave. Both of you and whoever those men are." "This is a legal matter, then pursue it through legal means," Don Aurelio said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "From somewhere that is not my kitchen." Don Clemente looked at Esperanza, then at Don Aurelio, then at the door. The two men behind him were already recalibrating the room. Don Clemente picked up the document. He straightened his jacket. "She has nothing that will hold up," he said. "You understand that. A widow with no name and no land and no standing." "She has standing here," Don Aurelio said. "That's the only standing that concerns me at the moment." Don Clemente left. The two men followed. The sound of their boots on the flagstone went across the yard, and then it was gone. Crisanto appeared in the doorway behind Esperanza. He was holding Toms by the hand. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Toms, who was 3 years old and had processed all of this at whatever level a 3-year-old processes a room full of tension, looked up at Crisanto and asked if the cattle were going to get water before dark. "Yes," said Crisanto. "They are." It was the right answer. The room came back to itself, but that night, after Toms was asleep under the cobija remendada and floor had settled and the finca had gone quiet, Don Aurelio went to the bedroom he had not entered since his wife died, and opened the Bible on the nightstand to the page where the photograph was kept. He had looked at it many times. He had always looked at his father. Tonight he looked at the woman standing beside him. The Vidal woman, young, smiling without knowing the photograph was being taken. He looked at the shape of her face, the particular way she held her shoulders, like someone accustomed to carrying things and at peace with that fact. He carried the photograph to the kitchen. He set it on the table. He sat there for a long time. In the morning he asked Esperanza what her father's name had been. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the shelf where his wife had kept the old accounts ledger and opened it to the back pages, where his father had kept records in a different hand, cramped, careful, the handwriting of a man who distrusted excess. He found the entry. He read it twice. He turned the ledger around on the table and set it in front of Esperanza without speaking. The entry read, "Settlement with Vidal family, March 1961. 200 hectares, north section, transferred in payment of debt owed. Witnessed, notarized Durango." Both parties satisfied. Esperanza looked at it for a long time. "My grandfather," she said finally. "My father," Don Aurelio said. "He settled a debt by transferring land." "Your grandfather's family owned the north section of this finca for 3 years before they had to sell it back during the drought of '64. I found the resale record last year when I was going through the old papers." He paused. "I always thought it was strange that my father kept such detailed notes about a transaction that seemed straightforward. I think now he felt it was not entirely resolved." Esperanza looked at the photograph he had set beside the ledger, at the woman standing beside the young Don Aurelio's father. Her grandmother's face, or someone who could have been her grandmother. The same shoulders. "They knew each other," she said. "I think they did," Don Aurelio said. "I think they may have known each other well." What had seemed like a rival by accident began to look, in the light of the kitchen on that February morning, like something that had been pending for 60 years. Winter gave way the way it does in the high Durango grassland, not softly, but decisively. 1 week of thaw that did not reverse. By March, the north pasture was green again. By April, the herd had grown by 14 head, because Esperanza had noticed that 2 of the cows were further along than Crisanto had realized, which Crisanto acknowledged with the grace of a man who has been corrected by someone more observant and finds it more useful than embarrassing. The fence lines held. The irrigation ditch was cleared. The old accounts, which Don Aurelio had been avoiding the way you avoid something you know will require more of you than you currently have to give, were organized and settled in stages. The Chihuahua buyer replaced through a contact Crisanto had in Torrin, who paid better, and came when he said he would. Toms learned to ride. Not well. He was 3, and then 4, and then the kind of riding available to a 4-year-old is limited. But he learned the idea of it, which Crisanto said was the part that mattered. Flor grew in the way babies grow on working farms, surrounded by sound and smell and movement, opinionated about all of it from the beginning. The old chair, La Silla del Corredor, moved from the bedroom to the kitchen to the corridor, and back again as the season changed, following the warmth and the light, and at some point it stopped being the chair Don Aurelio's father had made, and started being the chair where Esperanza sat in the evenings while she nursed Flor, with the cobija remendada across her lap, and Tom's wooden horse on the floor beside her feet where he had left it. On an evening in late autumn, the cattle came in from the north pasture at dusk, without being driven, fat, unhurried, moving through the gate one by one with the ease of animals who know the land and the light and the hour and have no argument with any of it. Don Aurelio stood at the fence and watched them come in the way his father had watched them come in, and his grandfather before that. The count was right. The animals were heavy in the good way, the way they get when a season has given them what they needed. Crisanto stood beside him. Toms stood beside Crisanto. Flor was in Esperanza's arms at the edge of the yard, awake and watching the cattle with the focused attention of a 10-month-old who has decided animals are worth considering. The cobija remendada was folded over the back of the old chair on the corridor, where it lived now in the evenings when the air cooled. The wooden horse was on the top fence rail where Toms had placed it to watch the cattle come in. The lamp on the porch was lit, had been lit every evening for months now, without decision, the way you re-establish habits that were always right and only needed the right person to remember them. Nobody said anything for a while. The animals moved through the gate. The light went gold on the Sierra, and then copper, and then the Sierra turned dark against the last of the sky. Then Esperanza said, quietly, to no one in particular, and to all of them at once, same time tomorrow. Crisanto almost smiled. Don Aurelio did not, quite, but his hands were still on the fence post, and he was not carrying anything. Sometimes God places exactly the right people at exactly the right door, not the door we would have chosen, and not at the hour we would have preferred, but at the door we left unlocked, because something in us knew better than to bolt it entirely. Don Aurelio Ibarra had sat in his father's chair for 11 months with nothing in his hands, and had thought himself finished with the part of life that required him to hold anything. He was wrong. Esperanza Vidal had walked 40 kilometers in sleet with a child at her side, and another on the way, with a patched blanket and a wooden toy horse, and no certainty beyond the next step. She arrived at a door. The door opened. What happened after that was not luck, and it was not charity. It was 2 people, on land that had always known both of their families, finding out that some debts are settled not in money or documents, but in the long, ordinary work of a shared life. Has anyone ever found a home in the place they least expected to find one? If this story reached you, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Like the video, subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo, and ring the bell so you don't miss a single story. Share this with someone who needs to remember that the door you almost didn't knock on might be exactly the door that was waiting for you. Until the next story, a heartfelt embrace from us to you. The cattle came through the gate, one by one, in the last light of the day, and they knew where they were going.